The image of mailed knights bearing crosses on their surcoats and banners, fighting for their faith under an alien sun. A familiar facade of modern Western perception of the past. And yet one of the most interesting aspects of the Crusades and crusading in general is the fact that they did not only leave a everlasting, permanent image and sign in our minds, but they also left a physical imprint on Europe. And the most evident of these are obviously the military-based sites linked to the holy orders that came, or holy orders of knights that came from the Crusades. And an example of these is, for example, the 14th century headquarters of the Teutonic Knights at Marienburg in, at the time, Prussia, but now actual modern-day Poland. Now, to begin with, there are two questions that I would like to pose now and possibly answer that I think are very important to sort of clarify what we are talking about before actually starting to mention what happened, the military situation, the battles, the sieges, the warriors, the soldiers. So question number one, what is a crusade? What were the Crusades? And question number two, how many Crusades were there? So, first things first, the term Crusades was not used until the 18th century, late 18th century. What this means is that at the time, the Crusaders did not refer to this holy war that they were fighting as the Crusades. It's a non-medieval Franco-Spanish hybrid of a word which started to be used in English in 1760. In other words, crusading is a historical phenomenon which lacked objective precision in its definition. In the Middle Ages, there existed no single word for what are now known as the Crusades, while those who took the cross was described as cruce signati, people, not exclusively male, signed with the cross. Their activities tended to be described by analogy, euphemism, metaphor, or generally peregrinatio, pilgrimage, iter, way or journey, crux, literally cross, negotium, business. This, of course, allowed for a flexibility of target and ideology. Pater noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittibus debitoribus nostris, et te nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen. Alright, so how many Crusades were there? Well, you see, the number will vary depending on the actual meaning we give to the word crusade. As, depending on the scholar or the book we are reading, meanings will vary depending on its usage. You have quite a few possible approaches. I would like to mention now the three major ones, which is the approach of traditionalists, the approach of pluralists, and the approach of generalists. So when you have a traditional approach, then you consider Crusades only the military expedition sanctioned by the Roman Catholic Church to gain land and control in the Holy Land. So, going to Jerusalem, trying to conquer the Holy Sepulchre. So all other wars that did not happen in the Holy Land, even if sanctioned by the Holy Roman Church, are not considered to be crusades. So the number will shrink dramatically. Pluralists, however, extend the meaning to all military campaigns sanctioned by the Pope, by the papacy. So, for example, this is why sometimes you call the Crusades, for example, fought in France against heretics, and we will mention these briefly on this video, as Crusades. But again, that's the pluralist approach, not the traditionalist approach. Now, when you see high numbers, such as 8 or 9 crusades, then you are reading a book which has a generalist's approach, meaning that all holy words linked to the Latin Church are considered to be crusades, no matter where they were fought or for what reasons. So as you can see, there is no definitive answer, and for this video we will take into consideration only the major crusades. Now also you have to consider that often scholars and historians, they organize history and the events in a way that makes it easier to explain things, to justify, to give a justification to the things that happen. But that also means that some of these criteria that they use are rather arbitrary. In fact, for example, between the First Crusade, which is the first official crusade, we will talk a little bit about the real First Crusade, the unofficial one that occurred in 1095, but the first official crusade endorsed by the Roman Catholic Church, which began in 1096 and ended in 1099. Now, after that, there were other expeditions that were used to give support, provide support and control other areas, but these are not considered crusades. Therefore, when we say the Second Crusade, which we will talk about, the second military campaign and officially endorsed by the Catholic Church, we tend to imagine that we have a First Crusade, nothing happened, and then the Second Crusade occurred. But it's not the case. It's just that that is a major military movement, and therefore, the very moment the historians decided to call it the Second Crusade, they also removed light from the other smaller expeditions that, in fact, in this video will only be mentioned. So, what is a knight crusader? Well, the first thing I'd like to say is, yes, a knight crusader is a knight, a nobleman, who has taken upon himself the cross for a variety of reasons. Some might have to do with his actual beliefs and religion and faith. Others might have to do with political reasons, economic reasons. We will see a few of these later on. But for now, please take into consideration that a knight crusader is not the only kind of crusader you had. It's just that you have a crusader who is also a knight, but there were many crusaders who were not knights, who were just soldiers, even regular people, to be honest, could become crusaders. So a crusader is someone who has taken upon himself the mark of the cross, heeding the call of the papacy, of the Holy See, to go and fight, whether it be against Islam or the Muslims, or whether it be against other Christians that have been excommunicated by the Church, or deemed to be enemies of the Catholic Church. So when we say Knight Crusader, an interesting thing to underline is that often we imagine the Knight Crusader as a knight in full mail with a surcoat, etc., great helmet, and that is of course the most iconic image, but that is also the image of knights during the First Crusade. But you see, crusades continued over the centuries, and therefore when you have a knight in the 12th century, knight in the 13th century, in late 13th century, and even in the 14th century and late 14th century, the equipment of such knight crusader will change completely. So we could say that in a way the sort of variety of equipment of knight crusaders will dramatically depend on the century that we're talking about, and therefore the crusade we are talking about. So when you imagine a knight crusader, the armor that he's wearing, the weapons that he's using, much will depend on what crusade you're talking about. I am a knight of the cross. I heard a preacher from the local church mentioning this war, a holy war, the will of the Lord. We shall depart for the Holy Land, the city in which the crucifixion of our Lord took place, Jerusalem. I've been preparing physically, mentally, spiritually, and yet I fail to understand, Lord. If this is your will you give me a sign? They say that by killing the enemies of the church, we shall receive a remission of our sins. And yet I ask, are you not the Prince of Peace? It is also important to see things into perspective. So, from the eyes of our Crusader knight that we are exploring the memories of, he was not embarking in a first crusade of a first of anything, to be honest. For the people, the knights, men-at-arms, even hangers and unarmed civilians who embarked in the call of the Pope, they were embarking on a general international large-scale assault which had no previous and hopefully will have no following. The perspective will change completely. Now we know what happened. But for those people who did not know how things would have panned out, it was very important, if not dramatically important, to always bring up stories of miracles, of things that had occurred, allegedly, in faraway lands where other crusaders had fought and miracles had happened and the skies had opened, accepting those who died and perished fighting for the cause of Christ directly into heaven. Now, of course, it's important not to imagine medieval people as being stupid or ignorant. I would imagine that some did give in to this sort of religious hysteria. Possibly they even believed it, but I would imagine that quite a few people didn't. And yet they continued. Why? Now, the reasons that led Pope Urban II to call and sanction the first official crusade can be multiple, and they can be understood in a protean variety of ways. And many are still debated by historians. So we don't have one complete image, but many possible readings. So, of course, the idea of opposing the Islamic menace, which was coming from Turkish lands, trying to stop the power, the growing power of Muslim sultans, is definitely one of the possibilities. It definitely plays a part. But I wouldn't say that that's the only reason. Jerusalem as a holy site was very important from a lot of point of views. It was a holy ground. It was sacred to both Christianity and Islam. Gaining control over the holy city would have secured power and prestige, and also the content of the masses. Also, we have to consider the fact that Pope Urban II was asked for help by the ruler of the Byzantine Empire. So again, it could have been a way to sort of strengthen the diplomatic relations between Western Christendom and Eastern Christendom, and possibly in the mind of the Pope, through his perception, possibly one of the hopes that he had was to, once unifying Eastern and Western Christendom, become the one and only ruler of Christianity. Also, one of the reasons why after the First Crusade, Second Crusade, Third Crusade started to become more and more popular is because of all the tales of all the riches and wealth that the surviving knights and soldiers and men-at-arms who participated in these crusades managed to acquire and come back home. Now again, the amount of mortality during these campaigns was very, very high, and yet people lusted. They craved these earthly possessions, and many did join these crusades for what could seem a very material rather than spiritual reason. So the Crusades appear as an expression of the authority of the papacy, securing its external frontiers, an experiment in European colonialism, if you will. Pope Urban II will decide to declare the First Crusade and raise an army for a variety of reasons. He will go on a preaching tour of France, which will be very successful. At a council of the Church held at Clermont in the French Auvergne in November 1095, after his preaching, a decree was issued that marked a new beginning in Western Christianity's use of war to further its religious mission. Whoever, for a devotion alone, nor to gain honor or money, goes to Jerusalem to liberate the Church of God, can substitute this journey for all penance. The Clermont Assembly was best remembered not for the legal authority granted by the decree, but for the Pope's sermon at the end of the council on the 27th of November. What the Pope said is not known. Witnesses and later commentators subsequently depicted him as delivering a rousing call to arms to the fighting classes of Western Europe to recover the holy city of Jerusalem, insisting that this was no ordinary act of temporal warfare, but a task enjoined on the faithful by God himself, a message echoed back in the cries of Deus lo volt, God wills it. Pope Urban appealed to a form of primitive religious nostalgia, we could say, embodied in the ambiguously liminal holy city of Jerusalem, lost to Christendom since its capture by the Muslims in 638, yet central to Christian imagination as the scene of the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. Now, before starting to talk about the first official crusade of 1096, I would like to mention the People's Crusade of 1095. After the preaching of Pope Urban II, a preacher, a monk by the name of Peter the Hermit, had managed to raise an army. And this will be the actual first crusade, although non-official or non-officially endorsed. Now, there is quite a bit of discussion, a certain level of discussion among historians as whether this full crusade was the idea of Peter the Hermit, or if it was actually launched by other players, more important players, or perhaps even the Pope himself. But although we don't have this information, one thing is for sure: the apocalyptic preaching of Peter the Hermit was very successful, and he managed to raise an army. Now, what's interesting to say is that there are quite a few possible names for this crusade: the People's Crusade, the Poor's Crusade, or the Crusade of the Poor, the Peasants' Crusade. But these are misnomers, because although it is true that this group or this army that was raised had a significant less number of well-trained armed knights, there were still knights in this crusade. There were still soldiers as well as untrained people. Differently from what a lot of people think, this first crusade, the first non-official crusade, the People's Crusade, this army did not lack cohesion and was actually able to march efficiently. Problem is that after 6 months, the entire army will be annihilated by Turkish forces. So why did these people decide to go? Why did they not wait for the other knights, the trained knights of the actual endorsed official crusade? And what convinced them to go? Well, I am sure that some of these people were fascinated and charmed by religious promises of ascension into heaven, and the whole idea of the apocalypse that had been coming, the end of days, which was a very popular idea, which was coming back in the 11th century and was therefore strengthened, and this allowed the preacher, Peter, to muster an army. But also many of these people had experienced drought, famine and disease, so probably it was a way for them to escape that reality. Unfortunately, the Jewish population will suffer a lot of losses, a lot of murders will be committed, not only by these crusades, but by the crusades in general, as often when we imagine the enemies of the crusades, of the crusaders, we always think of Islamic forces or the Muslims. But as a matter of fact, the crusades were used not only to kill Muslims, but also to kill Jewish, basically any non-Christian, and to be specific, any non-Catholic. And the reason why I'm saying non-Catholic is because we also have another crusade that we should talk about and we should mention in southern France. Official church teachings increasingly encouraged the wide application of wars of the cross, even if Innocent III, in his bull Quia Maior, was at pains to stress the priority of the Holy Land. One of the most notorious of all medieval wars, the Albigensian Crusade from 1209 to 1229, degenerated from an attempt to cauterize widespread heresy, which many saw as a dangerously infectious wound bleeding all Christendom, into a brutal land seizure. The puritanical dualists, the Cathars and other form of Christians, had grown in strength, and they were controlled by the Count of Toulouse. The assassination of the papal legate for the region in 1208 led Innocent III to offer Holy Land indulgences and the cross to northern French barons. The sack of Béziers in 1209 was remembered as especially brutal. Although a huge percentage of Cathars had been murdered, ultimately the Albigensian Crusade failed to eradicate them completely. However, crusades against heretics remained in the Church's arsenal for the rest of the Middle Ages and beyond. Protestant reformations in the 16th century stimulated a revival of crusade schemes against enemies of the Catholic Church, such as Henry VIII and Elizabeth I of England, and remained a traditional resort for devout and threatened Catholics in the new wars of religion. Urban II was already a sponsor of war against the Muslims in Spain. He therefore seized this opportunity to promote papal authority in temporal affairs. The opportunity was no accident, however, as Emperor Alexius I had been recruiting Western knights and mercenaries for years. He needed military success to shore up his domestic position. He, in other words, was trying to restore Byzantine control over Asia Minor and northern Syria, which was lost to the Turks since their victory over the Byzantines at Manzikert in 1071. The death of Malik Shah in 1092, who was the Turkish Sultan of Baghdad, meant the disintegration of his empire in Syria, Palestine and Iraq. But for this, he needed Western troops. This is how Urban transformed then their request for military aid into a campaign of religious revivalism. These recruitments stretched from southern Italy and Sicily to Lombardy, across great swatches, France, Aquitaine, province of Normandy, Flanders, and into the Low Countries, Western Germany, North Sea region, and Denmark. Possibly a number of fighting men sent to Asia Minor in 1096-1097 ranges between 50,000 and 70,000, excluding the non-combatant pilgrims who used the military exodus as protection for their own journeys. There were quite a few field generals that were leading the Crusaders' armies, the most effective of which was Bohemund of Taranto, head of the Normans from southern Italy. He arrived at Constantinople between November 1096 and June 1097. After the capture of Nicaea, capital of the Turkish Sultanate of Rum, Asia Minor, in June 1097, the campaign fell into four distinct phases. An arduous march across Asia Minor to Syria that saw a major but close-run victory over the Turks, which was followed by the siege and then defense of Antioch in northern Syria. One contingent from the main army under Baldwin of Boulogne established control of the Armenian city of Edessa beyond the Euphrates. As their difficulties proliferated, the depleted Western army increasingly regarded themselves as under the special care of God. The apparently miraculous discovery at Antioch of the Holy Lance that was said to have pierced Christ's side on the cross, and the victory a few days later over a numerically much superior Muslim army from Mosul boosted the morale. The final assault on Jerusalem was crowned with success on 15th of July. The ensuing massacre shocked Muslims and Jewish opinion. Four principalities were carved out on the Levantine mainland: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli. Collectively, these territories were known as the Land Overseas. The Eastern Crusaders were now directed at expanding, defending, or restoring these conquests. My armor protects me from my enemies. My faith protects me from the devils. It has been many months now. We've been traveling. People have died. Killed by the sword. Killed by disease. Where are you, Lord? Where is your healing hand? Why have you forsaken us? My faith collapses, and my human side prevails. My sword is my cross. In death, I seek my Maker. Okay, but I hope that you enjoyed this video. Of course, the topic of the Crusades is a massive topic, and I couldn't include all the Crusades, but I included the most famous one, trying to give the most important information. Of course, let me know if you liked this video, and I hope that you enjoyed it, of course. Thank you so much for your support, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.